Excuse me. Good morning and welcome to the IISS US. My name is Bryce Campbell. I'm the managing director of our office here in Washington. And we are lucky enough to be joined by one of our colleagues from London, Mr. Christian Mière, who is our senior fellow for naval forces and maritime security based in London. And while he is not studying things that float, he is keeping an eye on things in Asia. A number of you know he spent a number of years at Jane's before joining the Institute and has a long history of tracking security, regional politics, etc., with particular interest in China and its neighbors. So we're very fortunate to have him here with us this week and speaking with you all today. Christian plans on discussing some of the current shifts or possible shifts in Asia's strategic relations ahead of the coming APEC meeting that I'm sure you are all aware of. And I would be remiss if I did not point out that history is always an important part of discussing Asian relations, and we just so happen to have one of our new Adelphi publications from our colleague William Chung in the Singapore office that ties the divide, that really gives a terrific examination of the historical claims, both territorial and otherwise, between China and Japan, and provides a really nice context for a lot of the debates going on in the region to this day. All of the members of the audience should have received their copy or will soon, just to point out that it is available for sale in the back of the room for those who are so interested. In terms of the logistics for this morning, Christian's going to talk for 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to a discussion. We look forward to your questions. With that, I will turn it over to Christian.
Thank you very much, Bryce. And thank you all for coming this morning. I was considering when I came over here what to talk about, and with the APEC meeting this weekend in Beijing, it seemed like a very useful hook and a very interesting event to discuss, particularly as it's being held in Beijing, and there's plenty of discussion over the various meetings of heads of state at APEC and the East Asia Summit that might occur. But in trying to formulate a theory or a stream of consciousness around this particular event, I came up with the idea that we are currently seeing the stage being set within Asia for the possibility of collaboration and conciliation rather than the conflict we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years. And this might be a slightly controversial theory, and I might not be able to make the case for it very well, so you'll have to bear with me, but I will look forward to your feedback on the possibility as well. So one of the reasons that I thought about this as a topic was that we've seen, I believe we've seen a shift in China's regional relations over the last few months. Some of that has been implicit through the fewer patrols by Chinese Coast Guard vessels around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands than in the past. And that's in sharp contrast to what we saw in the South China Sea with the deployment of the oil rig between May and July. And so part of that is because the sharp spike in Chinese patrols in September 2012 after the nationalization of the islands, and since then we've had a gradual decline in the number of patrols. In fact, in early October, as that top graph shows, we saw 2 weeks of absolutely zero patrols around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands for the first time in about 2 years. Now, obviously, gauging what's happening within the black box of Chinese politics is always a bit difficult, but I would put forward the idea that China is gradually easing the number of patrols around the islands because it's already made the political points it needed to make in September 2012 and early 2013 about equal administration of the islands in the East China Sea. And so now it can utilize, it can wind down the number of patrols, save money, save effort, and create a slightly more benign diplomatic environment between itself and China. We've also seen China make amends with various other countries. That there is a picture of Chinese Premier Li and Vietnamese Premier Nguyen. After the almost unprecedented level of tension we saw between the two in the summer with the deployment of the Chinese oil rig near the Paracel Islands, there's been a concerted diplomatic effort since about August by both sides to try and ease tensions with high-level meetings and vague but nonetheless fairly substantive agreements on maritime security and other areas as well. So there's been a real shift in the bilateral relations between the two since then. It's not just China. Japan equally has been engaged in, since 2012, in furious diplomacy, particularly with Southeast Asian countries, driven by Prime Minister Abe, but equally a variety of less high-profile meetings with various regional countries. with South Korea since April in discussions over the history issue, particularly over comfort women. There may not be that much optimism over how that develops, but nonetheless it's significant that Japan is willing to have that conversation, even while domestically issues around Yasukuni, around comfort women, around the Kono apology are much more controversial. The meetings between Japan and North Korea over the abductees are also, I would suggest, indicative of both sides willing to negotiate in a way that they haven't for a couple of years as well. Again, North Korea's engagement with the abductee issue has been patchy at best over the last decade or so, but there does appear to be an attempt by the North Korean side to be able to reopen that line of negotiation to see where it leads and to enable a lowering of tension between the two states. And of course, there's been a very dramatic attempt by Japan to engage with China over the last 6 months or so, with a view to having a meeting between Abe and Xi at APEC this weekend. Now, that meeting may well not go ahead in the formal sense, although there will be an informal meeting between the two, because China has set 3 conditions for that meeting, including an acknowledgement of the dispute of the Senkaku-Gyro Islands, a promise not to visit Yasukuni from Abe, and an explanation of Abe's proactive pacifism. And Japan certainly is not willing to meet all 3 conditions, although it has made concessions on the possibility of the acknowledgement of a dispute with a very vague statement that would allow it to reassert its sovereignty over the islands, but acknowledge its awareness of China's claim to the islands as well, which would be a significant shift in Japanese policy and does demonstrate that Japan is keen to move the debate along. And so we've seen a series of meetings between Japanese diplomats, up to and including former Japanese Prime Minister Fukuda in quite recently, actually, and back in July, meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, all in a build-up to a potential Xi-Abe meeting at some point. There has also been shifts, I would suggest, in the inter-Korean relationship and North Korea's relations with other countries. There was obviously the very dramatic delegation to the Asian Games at the beginning of last month, which led to a very high-level meeting. That hasn't gone anywhere further because of various conditions set on negotiations by South Korea and other countries, with North Korea, as many of you will be aware, keen to have negotiations with a few of those conditions met. But North Korea has been made very aware of and slightly concerned by improvements in Chinese-South Korean relations, which I would argue is actually one of the main drivers for shifts in North Korea's policy recently. The Xi-Pak meeting at APEC this weekend will be the 5th meeting between the two countries' presidents, in a very rapid and very warm and consensual diplomatic engagement between the two. Discussions on a free trade agreement between the two countries is ongoing and looks set to proceed ahead of any kind of trilateral agreement with Japan. So the warmth between the Chinese and South Korean governments is a great concern for the North Korean government and a great motivator for North Korea to attempt other diplomatic maneuvers to try and sever that connection between the two. So I would suggest that all these shifts in diplomacy from Japan, from North Korea, from China, and from Southeast Asian countries has not yet created what one might call the Great Rapprochement, but has set the stage for a rapprochement across the region that would allow for an easing of tensions, certainly in the short to medium term. And I would suggest there are several reasons why that might be the case. The first is that we saw a changeover in administrations, particularly in Northeast Asia, from late 2011, including Kim Jong-un, including President Park, including Prime Minister Abe, and President Xi Jinping as well. And as with any new administrations, they had a case to be made for their own policies. They had to assert their authority and develop their own specific policy manifestos. And to a large extent that has been done. Xi Jinping has created his idea of a China dream. He has demonstrated his nationalistic and militaristic credentials. He's pursued his anti-corruption drive. Prime Minister Abe has fairly successfully pursued his reinterpretation of the Constitution. Kim Jong-un has very successfully launched a significant purge of Jang Song-taek and related individuals. And so now that those administrations have got over that initial hump in furious policymaking, they're able to think about longer-term policies that will be more beneficial for the countries. And in many cases, that is a policy that would lead to a lowering of tension with regional countries rather than those policies they needed to effect immediately that created significant tensions between the various regional countries. I'd also suggest that there are other immediate policy goals that have been realized by the countries. A key one for China has been equalization and administration in the East China Sea. The launch of patrols from September 2012 onwards was designed, to my mind, to indicate that China has an equal claim to the islands as Japan, and to undermine the argument that Japan maintains unilateral sovereignty over the islands. Now, it has no legal standing, but it does have an effect in the International Court of Public Opinion. Equally, I would suggest that the November 2013 Air Defence Identification Zone was an attempt by China to demonstrate equalization of the administration of the airspace over the islands. The patrols are demonstrating equalization of the water and the ADIZ of the airspace of the islands. Given that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan already had ADIZs, again, it was an equalization rather than any kind of enforcement of assertiveness by the Chinese. Now they have demonstrated their equalization of administration. They are able to affect other policies that are not necessarily as conflictual or confrontational, and maybe more conciliatory as well. For Japan, the reinterpretation of the constitution was a major issue that they were clearly working towards within the first 12 to 18 months, and although not finalized, has reached a stage where it is likely to go through with Komeito support to a satisfactory degree for the Japanese government. And finally, the nuclear test for North Korea was, again, another immediate policy goal that was reached in 2013, to the extent that another test was not seen as necessary in early 2014, despite particular activity around the nuclear test site. I would also suggest that various regional countries were very aware of damage done by the more confrontational diplomacy between them all. In particular, Sino-Southeast Asian relations were heavily impacted by China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, with the oil rig, but also with other issues with the Philippines around around Scarborough Shoal and around Second Thomas Shoal as well. And that has allowed for a stronger strengthening of particularly Vietnam's relations with other states, and a drive for Southeast Asian states to invest in various military capabilities, which are necessarily negative for China's view of stability within the region and for China's influence within the region. Japanese investment in China has already started to fall. Last year it fell by about 4%, and in the first half of this year was down by almost 50% on a year-on-year basis. Although that's not necessarily going to be a strategic shock for China's economy, at a time when China is going through a structural shift in its economic growth, it's a further challenge that it may not wish to see. And sanctions on North Korea and shifts in the Sino-South Korean relations have obviously had effects on the North Korean economy, and were they eased will be a much easier situation for the North Korean regime to deal with. So in order to mitigate these damages and also to having reached their immediate policy goals, the various countries are able to affect policies and diplomacy at the moment that is far less confrontational than over the last 2 years. I would also suggest that it's happening within a much wider context of China launching several schemes that are designed to increase its soft power and influence. Perhaps the most dramatic of them has been the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with 21 countries signed up initially, and Indonesia joining just yesterday, an initial capital of $50 billion. AIIB sits alongside the BRICS Bank, and also concepts like the new Silk Road and the Maritime Silk Road, and the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to new members and to a slightly broader mandate, including economic issues at the last Head of State meeting, as an attempt to sinicize the international system, particularly within Asia, but more broadly as well. And this is really the first concerted effort by China to challenge the US-led post-1944-45 international system and rules-based order that we've seen. That's not to say that China isn't going to play by the rules, it's just that it wants to have Chinese rules in place, or rather Chinese leadership for the rules that are already in place. And to be able to do that, to be able to affect these various soft power instruments, China needs to have influence with countries, and it's not going to have those influence if it pursues the same confrontational policies that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years. I titled this slide Hard to Soft. There's a suggestion that we might be moving from a hard power focused policy to a soft power focused policy by China. The two are obviously not mutually exclusive. You can easily try and pursue soft power while also trying to pursue hard power. But in the case of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, more assertive policies have been very harmful to China's soft power and influence in the region. Having said all that, and putting forward what might be too optimistic a view here in terms of the regional relations moving from a very confrontational period to a slightly more conciliatory one, I don't believe that the fundamentals that have driven tension in the region over the last few years have changed in any way, particularly in the maritime disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Primarily they are driven by the rise of China and the changes to the regional order and the international order that is being affected by the rise of China. And North Korea's demand for nuclear security, which is its ultimate security guarantee, and therefore really a red line for North Korea in terms of being able to ensure the survival of its regime and the security of its the government. And for that reason, I think we're going to continue to see, particularly from China, but perhaps also from other states, a conflict management strategy rather than a conflict resolution strategy. That is, China may not be hiding its capabilities as much as it has done over the last 30 years in what Deng Xiaoping called the hide and bide strategy, but it's still biding its time because it knows that in 20 to 30 years' time, if current situation progresses as one expects, it will be in a much more powerful situation to try and resolve these disputes, either through negotiation or through the use of hard power than it is now. So for China, it still makes sense to continue to maintain these tensions and conflicts without leading to war, but also without leading to any kind of negotiated resolution until 20 to 30 years' time, it's able to sit down and have a much stronger hand to play. So that is the theory. Many of you may well disagree with it. I would like to hear your opinion on it. But I would suggest that we are now in a situation that will be demonstrated in APEC and the East Asia Summit where the stage is set for more conciliatory diplomacy and regional relations. Events may well overtake that potential for conciliatory diplomacy, and if we see, let's say, Chinese fishermen being arrested by the Japanese Coast Guard or even sunk by the Japanese Coast Guard, then necessarily the two sides will have to react. But if we are lucky enough to avoid such events, we may see a period of slightly more conciliatory diplomacy and a slight lowering of tensions in Asia.
Great, thank you, Christian. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience. I think one question I have that you could probably speak to is how much of these recent changes or shifts are part of longer-term developments that really maybe shouldn't be catching us off guard, and are there other sort of macro-level undercurrents, perhaps from other powers in the region that might also be worth paying attention to? I'm sure in this audience, a lot of folks thinking United States policy, the rebalance, et cetera, but what other sorts of things are you keeping an eye on that are worth mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, I deliberately didn't talk about the US pivot slash rebalance because I see this as an Asian-led shift rather than one led by the US. That's not to say that the US doesn't have influence over it. One could argue that Japan is able to feel confident enough in its security to some extent because of the US alliance, or that China is deterred from any aggression towards the Philippines because of the US mutual security guarantee. But the changes I suggest might be happening in Asia at the moment through the various administrations in Northeast Asia in particular are due to the specific demands and requirements of those countries and those administrations rather than that of the US. I mean, certainly Washington is keen to encourage a closer relationship between Japan and South Korea, for instance, and has had limited success in doing so. But I think that's indicative of the fact that those countries will pursue such a policy when it is in their interests rather than when it's in the US's interests.
Sure. Questions from the audience? Yes, here in the front row. Oh, please wait for the mic, and then if you could just introduce yourself and state your affiliation.
Yes, thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. I'm Tomoko Kyoto. I'm a SPF fellow at the Pacific Forum CSIS, and then I'm working on India-US-Japan relations. During the Xi Jinping's visit to India, there's a border incursion along the border between India and China. From this event, Chinese experts' view is there are two: Xi Jinping's controlling military, or Xi Jinping's not controlling military. So which do you think?
I think Xi Jinping's relationship to the military is a very interesting topic to examine. It's not the first time that military events have happened that have undermined what could be seen as a diplomatic overture. The first test flight of the J-31 stealth fighter, which occurred at the same time as a visit of the US Secretary of Defense, was seen as a relatively independent PLA trying to influence politics or work autonomously from the CCP. The problem is it's impossible to tell. I think on the Indian border incursion, it's likely that that was not ordered by China or by the CCP in particular, but equally border incursions occur very frequently. So I'm not sure it's necessarily designed by the PLA to tie into the Xi Jinping visit as well. Xi's relationship with the PLA is relatively good, and I would argue that he's able to affect what would be otherwise very unpopular policies, such as an anti-corruption drive, particularly within the PLA, because he has a long-standing relationship with the military and security services. You know, his first job in the CCP was as a personal aide to the then defense minister, and his father, as a revolutionary, had very close links to the PLA. And since then, he's held a variety of different security positions within the CCP. So his credentials are seen, I think, as very secure by the PLA. He was made chairman of the CMC much more swiftly than Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, which I think was indicative of that as well. And he hasn't affected the kind of wide-ranging reform of the PLA that some believe is necessary by doing away with the military district, the military region system, which again allows him to have greater influence of the PLA in the short to medium term until he actually undertakes policies that could be seen as even more unpopular by certain cliques. In the meantime, I think he's trying to clear out some of the wood from the PLA, with, for instance, Xu Caiho being arrested, and also the Zhou Yongkang clique being almost removed in its entirety, so that he can solidify his control over the PLA. There are constant and much more frequent articles within Chinese media stating that the PLA is and should be subordinate to the CCP, which I don't think is a sign of any concern within the CCP necessarily, but simply a reiteration of the point of the PLA being the military wing of the CCP.
Great. He's here in the second row.
Gil Rosman, the Asan Forum. I have two questions. One is the omission of Russia, despite the fact it is intensifying its strategic and military ties to the region, especially in the Northeast, with a turn to the East that is more aggressive and insisting that China's its partner and is going to work with it with new arms sales to China that you may be following. The second is I didn't share your optimism about Abe's moves toward South Korea, given the intensification of coverage of the comfort women issue, besides the assurance that it's not going to be, the Kono statement won't be revised. But apart from that, I would argue that Abe has not done what's desirable towards South Korea, and it's a big problem for the United States. And the fact that Abe is not meeting Xi is an indication that this relationship is still more troubled than you may have suggested.
Yeah, I both agree and disagree with you. On the first point, I would disagree, although I would defer to my colleague Sam Charap, who's much more expert than me on Russian diplomacy and foreign relations. But you're right that Russia has demonstrated or suggested there is a more strategic alliance with China, particularly through the major gas deal. But it's also very happy to sell as many weapons as it possibly can to Vietnam, which is not in China's interest. It's keen to open greater energy links with Japan, and there has even been very positive steps over the last few years to try and finally resolve the Kuril Islands issue and sign a peace treaty with Japan. So I would suggest, and again Sam might have an opinion on this, but I would suggest that Russia is not just looking for a single strategic alliance in Asia, but is actually looking to play as many sides of Asia as it possibly can. Because it needs the resources and funds from Asia, and it is seeking to harness the economic growth in the region to a much greater extent. But I would agree with you on the second point. I mean, I think the weakness, one of the weaknesses, actually I'll say the only weakness of my theory is the history issue. And I think particularly domestic politics in Japan and history is a very complex situation, and it's tough to see how they can move forward on the history issue to a sufficient extent. I mean, I don't think there'll be any revision of the Kono apology, despite various controversial statements. I think whether or not Abe visits Yasukuni this year will be a significant sign of whether they are willing to move forward on the history issue, at least in a temporary way, to allow for an improvement in Sino-Japanese relations. I think that's why I was slightly more cautious in saying that we're not immediately seeing a new rapprochement in Asia, but rather the stage is set for that rapprochement. And if the various sides make the right moves, if Abe does not go to Yasukuni, if there is not some kind of drastic reinterpretation of the Kono or of the comfort women issue, then China may be willing to have some kind of head of state, head of government meeting, which hasn't happened since Abe came to power in 2012.
Again, here in the front row. If you want to take a couple at a time.
Yeah, sure. We got time.
Michael Yehuda at GW. I agree that there has been signs of a softer approach from the Chinese side, but I think your selection of evidence to support all of this can be questioned. For example, in the last few days, the Japanese have been openly complaining about Chinese fishermen coming along and destroying corals near islands, and this is not only within the EEZ, but it's even within the territorial waters, and these are not waters that the Chinese government claims. In Malaysia, recently, their position has toughened, partly in response to things which the Chinese have done, and they're now looking at the issue of allowing American planes to use some of their facilities. In Indonesia, there was a view that they might hope to act as some kind of mediator, but the way in which Chinese Coast Guards, backed by naval forces over the horizon, have stopped Indonesia from arresting fishermen who had clearly gone into the sea near Natuna Islands. As far as Vietnam was concerned, no sooner had they made their agreement they then, with the Chinese, they then got the Indians interested in exploring again waters which are disputed between Vietnam and China, and they had a formal sort of opposition by it from the Chinese side. Meanwhile, the Chinese, as you indicated, have not been sitting on their hands. In the south, they have developed some of the facilities available to them in the South China Sea, building also some sort of airfield, and so the pressure continues. Now, we have seen the Chinese play this game before. In 2009, they were all over the place. They then found, much to their annoyance, that in association with Hillary Clinton's position in July, I think it was, of 2010, a lot of the other Southeast Asians joined in. The Chinese softened a bit. And then afterwards, they tightened a bit. So what you're dealing with, it seems to me, are tactical changes as seen from the interests of the Chinese leaders. And these will vary, these will change according to how they may perceive things. Obviously, at a time in which Xi Jinping is trying to set out a vision for Asia as a whole, in which none of the conflicts is even mentioned. There's the suggestion that somehow the more the different parties join in some sort of web with China at the center, then all these things will go away. Well, I don't know how many in China believe that, but that's hardly welcome to the neighbors at the moment. So I think to bring it very shortly, I think you're exaggerating the significance of these small changes.
Well, thank you. I think it's important to separate out the East China Sea from the South China Sea because they're quite different scenarios. And China's approach to both of them often varies. There's, in fact, often the opposite approach is taken in the East China Sea and South China Sea at any one time. With the East China Sea, the Chinese because of historical issues, because of a greater balance of power between the two, it's actually sometimes harder for the Chinese to be conciliatory towards the Japanese, as it is in the South China Sea, where China is a much more powerful actor in a bilateral basis and therefore can feel confident in any conciliation that it pursues in there. So with the fishermen around the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, it's obviously a concern for the Japanese, and it's probably a sign that the Chinese have at the very least implicitly allowed their fishermen to patrol there or to fish there because they have stopped actually preventing them from doing so. But I don't see necessarily that's not a sign of very mild conciliation. I think the Japanese would prefer to have fishermen there. Well, I think it's less a sign of state assertiveness if fishermen are fishing there than Chinese Coast Guard patrol vessels are patrolling there.
I was talking about islands that are not in dispute too.
Yeah, no, indeed. But I think one of the concerns the Japanese may have is that the fishermen will not just be in Japanese waters where it's less legally controversial, but may migrate towards the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands as well, where, particularly in 2010, for instance, the arrest of Chinese fishermen caused significant diplomatic concerns. So, I'm not sure that the presence of fishing vessels and fishermen is necessarily a sign that China isn't willing to negotiate to a greater extent with Japan. I don't want to overstate this issue. I think we're not yet in a period of diplomatic sunshine and well-being, but we are in a stage where, if all sides pursued similarly conciliatory policies, then we could see an easing of tension for some time. But that is always going to be temporary because, as I would say, the fundamentals are unchanged. And those fundamentals are driven by the rise of China, they're driven by history issues, they're driven by all sorts of things. In the South China Sea, I think it's slightly more complex because the Chinese development of its features in the Spratly Islands, again, is an equalization of the South China Sea issue. China is the last occupant of the Spratly Islands. I mean, it physically was the last occupant of the Spratly Islands, but it's also the last one to build an airstrip down there. Every other state within the Spratly Islands that occupies islands has an airstrip already. So the Chinese could argue, with some justification, that all it's doing is what everyone else has already done. And the construction in the Chinese islands is happening just as the Vietnamese are building further harbour capabilities within some of their islands. The Taiwanese are also building a harbour on Itu Harbour to allow for greater deployment of naval and Coast Guard vessels. China is not the only one that is developing these islands, and no doubt the development of its islands, and they're not actually islands, they're mostly reefs. The development of the reefs is much more extensive than we're seeing from the other players, and I'm not suggesting it's a positive move in any way, but I would say that the developments are not necessarily. It's unclear exactly how those developments will be used. My concern is that the airstrip might be used for an ADIZ in the South China Sea. And one of the reasons an ADIZ hasn't been announced in the South China Sea is that China does not have the capabilities to actually patrol an ADIZ. And the Spratly Island airstrip would allow it to do so. But I think there are other reasons, other factors that mitigate against the development of an ADIZ in there, including the much more difficult multilateral diplomatic terrain that China has to negotiate there. So in the South China Sea, I would suggest that it's much easier for China to be conciliatory because it's a much stronger power relative to the various other powers. It has seen significant diplomatic setbacks in the Southeast Asian region because of its recent assertiveness, and that could, and may not necessarily, but could lead to a more conciliatory diplomacy for a short period of time. But again, the fundamentals are unchanged. Even if we do see a slightly more benign Chinese diplomacy in the region, it's unlikely to last for a very long time.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Rich Cronin from the Stimson Center. Christian, I'm skeptical also about whether the stage is set for anything, certainly, especially Rapprochement. But still, we have the issue, and I agree with you, South China Sea and East China Sea are different issues in a major way. But, we still have the issue of what has caused the zigs and the zags. And it seems to me that they center more around international Asia-wide events, ASEAN meetings, now APEC coming up, et cetera, which China's hosting. So would you take your analysis a little further and give us some thoughts as to how your interpretation might play out in these APEC meetings? I mean, what does this, where is it going in that sense?
And do you mean where is APEC going, or where is?
Well, how would Chinese efforts at, if you will, rapprochement or conciliation, et cetera, that's true. I mean, how does it play out in these meetings that China is hosting?
What would we look for? What sort of indicators would be present?
Which, of course, in which, of course, the U.S. and Southeast Asian countries are both major players, as well as Japan. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, obviously, the surest sign would be a formal meeting between Xi and Abe, but I do admit that's currently unlikely because of the Japanese unwillingness to accede to Chinese demands for such a meeting. But Chinese attempts to avoid more controversial issues, let's say, such as Taiwan and maritime disputes, and focus on issues that are of shared strategic goals, both with the US, such as Ebola, such as counterterrorism, such as North Korea, such as Afghanistan, but also with Southeast Asian states, including things like maritime security or maritime security collaboration, would be indicative of the Chinese emphasizing those issues that are much more shared goals from the various states within the region and beyond the region, and therefore perhaps suggest that the Chinese are willing to pursue a more conciliatory tone for the short to medium term. It's a large diplomatic meeting. There's a lot of different individuals involved. It's sometimes difficult to really take the tone of any such meeting because there's so many moving parts at any one time. But I think if we see a weekend, and in fact further that into East Asia Summit next week, of no statements, deliberate and assertive statements of, for instance, sovereignty or claims in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and instead language that is designed to accede to others' points of view, particularly on the maritime disputes, but also on issues such as trade and other areas, then it could indicate that Beijing in particular is keen to pursue a more benign diplomatic policy for the short term.
Yes, also here towards the front. I have no watch. So
Thanks, Ellen Frost from East West Center and National Defense University. A couple of comments that leads to a question. The first, your title, The Great Rapprochement, sounds like grand strategy, and I sort of agree with Professor Yehuda that I think it's more sort of tactical, but that's just a question of title. The second, an argument on your side has to do with the United States. I take your point that this is about intra-Asian relations, but the United States is a factor, I think, in intra-Asian relations. And sort of a point on your side is that, if you recall, when the Trans-Pacific Partnership acquired U.S. support, then the Chinese went into a tizzy and said, this is containment, this is encirclement, all this kind of stuff. And then, as you know, they gradually evolved to the point where they're actually interested in possibly joining it in the future. Since trade agreements have a heavy geopolitical aspect, I thought that was significant. But the question is sort of related. China did participate in Cobra Gold this year, and there's sort of, in some areas like Afghanistan, they seem to be moving away a little bit from just mineral extraction to more, whatever you call it, responsible world power, whatever, responsible stakeholder, whatever. So there's some softening there too, which I think makes it easier for our friends and allies in Asia if they don't feel pulled between the United States and China. So do you see, what I can never figure out is, there are many Chinas, many groups in China, but do you think the Chinese have a strategy in Asia? They don't interfere with human rights. They don't lecture them on labor and environment, all this stuff the Americans do. And that's welcome in many parts of Asia. On the other hand, nobody has a clue as to what kind of Asia China would like to see, other than having more influence. Influence to do what? As you follow Chinese behavior, can you sort of, do you have any glimmerings of what Chinese strategy, as opposed to tactics, might be?
I think it's a good question. I think there's plenty of debate around exactly what China would like. There are those that consider China is looking for a return to the Great Middle Kingdom and a series of vassal or tributary states around China. I'm not sure that China is so beholden to its history that it seeks an international order that's exactly the same as its imperial system. But I do think it would like to be the hegemonic power within Asia, and it would like to have the influence that comes along with that. Without the intervention and interference of outside states such as the US. I think one of the things that's interesting about what I call the Sinicization of the international order in Asia, particularly through the AIIB and the New Silk Road, is that Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is that China's really focusing on Central Asia here and kind of leaving maritime Asia to the US for the time being. And that's partially because China is able to effect change in its diplomacy in Central Asia. Central Asia is made up of a number of different states, but they are by and large underdeveloped. They are by and large, they're often autocratic, and they appreciate China's non-intervention stance and lack of conditions on assistance and aid. And so for that reason, China can use Central Asia not only to increase its own influence, but also as a bridge to the Middle East, which is of key strategic significance to China. So I would imagine, and I would perceive China's strategy to some extent to be to increase its influence initially in Central Asia to a much greater extent, while trying to maintain relationships with maritime Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, without them descending into conflict or encouraging a much stronger relationship with the US. What the future international order looks like for China, or as China with the regional hegemon, isn't entirely clear. I personally don't perceive China as disagreeing with the rules-based order that currently exists at a theoretical level. The rules-based order has been very good for China, particularly over the last 30 years. It has acceded to the WTO. It has used its veto much less frequently, the UNSC, than the 4 other P5 members. I think China likes the fact that there are rules that have helped make it rich. It just wants to be more in charge of those rules, or at least have a greater influence over those rules. And that's why we see AIIB and BRICS being created, so that IMF and World Bank, which haven't been swift enough in China's view to provide the kind of influence it feels it should have, are not, at least have some competition out there.
Great. Yes, here in the middle.
Thank you. Edward F., Georgetown University. What is going on with the air defense identification zone? This was portrayed in the media here as a huge problem and a dangerous situation, and then it just disappeared. I mean, are countries abiding by it? Are countries ignoring it? Are the Chinese intercepting flights in it? What is happening? Thank you.
So there is some shadowing of military aircraft by Chinese military aircraft in the ADIZ. Different states have different policies. Almost all international air carriers are abiding by the requirements of the ADIZ, but militaries such as the US and Japan are not doing what the Chinese would like. The situation is not that different from that which existed within the Soviet Union, which is that there are regular interactions between military aircraft and, in fact, military vessels in the air and in the seas around China, but we only really hear about it when something goes a little bit wrong. So that might be, for instance, the Chinese engaging in slightly aggressive maneuvers towards a US warship, or it might be the buzzing of a Japanese aircraft a little bit too closely by the Chinese. There is a fairly regular, not daily, but fairly regular occurrence of military aircraft being within sight of each other and within contact with each other within the Chinese ADIZ or within the Japanese ADIZ as well. So it currently exists. One just has to hope there are no particular accidents that happen. I will say one other thing, which is indicative of perhaps not Chinese conciliation, but certainly China's awareness of other states' concerns, is the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which was signed in May 2014, which has been in the works for about 10 years and was suddenly given a diplomatic push by the Chinese at the Fullerton Forum that IISS holds in Singapore every year. In January, the PLAN indicated to the US and everyone else there that it was willing to sign the Qs because it had understood that states in the region, particularly Japan, are very keen to have some kind of rules of the road for naval vessels interacting. Now, the Qs is a very very limited agreement and is not that much greater than most international agreements to operate at sea anyway. But it is, I think, a significant diplomatic document indicating that China is aware that there do need to be rules of the road to make sure there are no accidents between various vessels at sea.
It's here in the back side.
Thank you very much. My name is Ping. I'm from Epoch Time newspaper. I have kind of 3 questions. First one, should President Obama mention human rights during the APEC trip to Beijing? And what's your thoughts? And second, with all the conflict inside of China, like Hong Kong and how you just mentioned, what do you think this gonna affect China, especially CCP structure, and also how this gonna affect Asian Pacific structure? Thank you.
Whether Obama should mention human rights at APEC, I'm meant to be going on CCTV tonight, so I will say no. But really, I think I think it would be great to bring up the human rights issue from a human rights perspective. There are various human rights concerns within China that should be raised at various points, and a long time in the distant past, about 6 years ago, at the beginning of the Obama presidency, Obama and Clinton were very keen to stress that human rights would be core to their China strategy. That went out the window very quickly, and since then it's been very low down the priority list for the administration. So, as a liberal Westerner with an airy-fairy point of view, I would like to see human rights raised, but if I was an Obama administration strategist, I'm not sure there would be that much to gain from raising it at this point. When there are various other issues that they need to work with on the Chinese, when the military-to-military relationship is actually developing quite well, perhaps it's best not to rock the boat on that particular issue right now. Hong Kong, I think, is a very interesting series of events and an ongoing situation. I think it's interesting not just because of what it means for Hong Kong itself. I can understand that the CCP feels slightly aggrieved by what's happening in Hong Kong because their suggested form of selection for the chief executive is not actually out of line with the Basic Law and the 1984 Sino-UK agreement. In fact, it's very much what was written into the Basic Law. But nonetheless, it does not match with the goals and aims and aspirations of the Hong Kong electorate and population. I think the most likely outcome there is some kind of negotiated solution, perhaps involving a different kind of nominating committee, or maybe even an agreement that post-2017 elections will move further down towards a democratization path. But for me, the interesting thing is not just what happens in Hong Kong, but what it means for the CCP more broadly. Because China has undertaken a very gradual process of political reform. And the CCP has been aware of various voices and movements within China, which are much more vocal now because of the use of social media, that are calling for political reforms. The latest plenary session focused on the rule of law, and I think that's indicative of the fact that the CCP is aware of things like the constitutionalism movement that seeks to highlight the constitution as the basis of law in China. And there has been regular discussions of China moving towards a more democratic or democracy with Chinese characteristics path for its future political reform. Now, when I've spoken to Chinese officials about what that means, that does seem to be a kind of single-party democracy. That is, you can all vote, and you can all vote for whichever candidate you want, as long as it's a CCP candidate we've already chosen, and you'll all feel great about being democratic. So actually, that's not that far away from the Hong Kong model, which is it's the Henry Ford model of democracy. You can have any candidate you want, as long as that candidate, well, it's not black, but as long as that candidate is a candidate we've already chosen. And so Hong Kong is, to that extent, a kind of a microcosmic indicator of where China could have gone, in 30 to 40 years along its democratization path. But if they're unable to affect that change in Hong Kong, a territory with 7 million people, it's not clear how they'll be able to do it in a country of 1.3 billion people. And the lesson of Hong Kong is that once you start giving political freedom, or once a population has various freedoms such as freedom of the press, freedom of association, judicial independence, it's very difficult to then restrain the aspirations of that population and bring into effect the political system you want to see rather than the political system they want to see.
Great. Yes, towards the back there.
Hi, Ken Meyercord, World Docs. If Japan recognized that there is a dispute over the Senkaku's values, do you think the two parties might agree to take their case to the International Court of Justice? And in that regard, would you like to speculate on how the court might rule?
Well, I would not like to speculate because I don't think it's going to happen. And also, I'm not an international lawyer, so I don't feel qualified to gauge the validity of either side's case. Even if Japan does recognize the dispute, and it's not saying it will currently recognize the dispute, it will just make itself publicly aware that there is a Chinese claim to the islands, which is a slightly different mealy-mouthed way of trying to avoid the issue. China would not want to take it to the ICJ anyway, and has rejected any kind of third-party arbitration mechanism in the South China Sea. As is its legal right, it has opted out of third-party arbitration mechanisms under UNCLOS, so it is not bound to take these disputes necessarily to an arbitration mechanism, and it will avoid doing so because of the hypocrisy that could be labelled as being its policy if it did it in the East China Sea and not the South China Sea. It continues to reject the Philippine arbitration mechanism for exactly that reason. So I don't think it's likely that Japan will recognise the dispute. I don't think either side are keen to take it to the ICJ. And were they to do so, I'm not sure what the outcome will be, which is not a very satisfactory answer, but I'm afraid it's the only one I have.
Great. Yes, up here in front. Scott.
Yeah, Scott Snyder, Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for a provocative presentation. I note that your glass has remained full throughout. I want to get back to this AIIB and SICA issue, because as you focused on the shift from hard to soft in China's approach, it seems to me that one of the major tests for your hypothesis is going to be whether or not we see actually emergence of a norm-setting competition within Asia, and how Asian parties will respond. Of course, we've got the East Asia Summit as part of this package of summits coming up. And I think that some, certainly here in Washington in the Obama administration, would like to see EAS strengthened to be an institution that regionalizes the application of international norms. But then we have these new institutions and questions about whether they're going to adhere to international norms. And so I'd like to draw you out a little bit more on whether that's going to end up being a source of competition or conflict, and what Xi and China should do in order to try to assert that these are actually international norm reinforcing, as you suggested earlier.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. The thing about AIIB is that it's not entirely clear what conditions might be attached to lending, what lending structures are, or even what the governance structure is. And until it's clarified, it's difficult to talk about exactly how it fits into the normative environment within Asia more broadly. There is a suggestion that China-led vehicles like this, or heavily Chinese-influenced vehicles like this, will be less concerned by what are currently international and regional norms, because they rely on a unconditional aid and assistance program. And if that's the case, then it is a competition for the US-led normative environmental norm-setting policy, because essentially you're competing a very rigid and heavily normative ideal for the regional order against one that is less focused on having international norms of any form. But we don't know that to be the case at the moment, and some of the criticisms levelled at AIIB and some of the reasons that South Korea and Australia have not joined AIIB are because of the lack of clarity over some of the lending structures and conditions. There were even greater concerns over that previously, and in negotiations with India and the various other states, some of those seem to have been resolved. So I would suggest that while it is certainly a competition for influence and soft power in the region, there does appear to have been a conciliation by China in acceding to what are seen as international norms in terms of how money is lent to states and what structures exist, even if there isn't the conditions placed on issues like human rights that you might find from other lending institutions. I think the difficulty with having the regionalization of norms is just the sheer diversity of political actors and states within Asia. obviously, and it's not just China that is at the basis of this. How do you bring together political actors that are as different as the Laotian government and the Singaporean government and the Japanese government, and get them all to agree on a series of international norms that they can abide by? And I don't really see any way around that, even with the prioritization of the EAS by various parties as the primary multilateral instrument to affect policy within the region. For me, I think there are various hindrances to norm setting within the region, and they are not all entirely or primarily down to China. China has made some steps towards accepting the idea of international norms through the various instruments it's currently setting up, but doesn't appear to have acceded to what might be seen as Western ideals of what those norms might be. But there are other barriers to having a regionalization of such norms, particularly when you include actors with independent views such as Russia as well.
Great. Well, I think we've reached the end of our session today. I'd like to thank you all for your wonderful questions and contributions, and please join me in thanking Christian for his presentation and remarks.